Hello and welcome back, guys. Today we're going to take a look at Shadowhunter leveling and which abilities you should keep in mind. Also, some filler options here and there, just like the previous video. And without further ado, let's get started. Let's start out with the most basic demonic or Shadowhunter ability, and that is Demonic Clone. This is used both for single target DPS and AoE. It's a perfect starter attack, especially because you will get this at level 10, which is basically, the baseline where you start at. Vital Point Strike, Chain Attack, and Encroachment Discharge. Just a quick disclaimer, you can see in the third tripod row two different options. One increases your identity meter gain and the other one disables it or uses the identity meter to actually do more damage. Generally speaking, the transformation isn't as consistent during leveling. You will need an engraving later on to be a real transformation demonic. During the leveling process, I would suggest that you pick the ones that do more damage instead of the ones that give you more identity meter. Next up, we talk about another very basic ability, which is super important for Shadowhunter, which is Demonic Slash. Excellent mobility, nimble movement, and chain charge. Keep in mind here, every level of this ability is fine, so you could run this on 4 points, you could run this on a 7 level, or you can run this on a 10th level, depending on how many points you have left over. If you're trying to get through dungeons quickly, if you try to move between place and place very fast, this gives a lot of mobility, and on top of that, a mobility buff, a movement speed increase. So this is the most baseline mobility ability that you have, and I would always have this at the back of your mind. If you have some points left over, maybe get this to level 7, and later on in the leveling process, you can also spec into Chain Charge, which gives you 2 charges of this ability, so you can keep the movement up for longer. Next up, Demonic Vision. Now this one is very interesting because it's your first real ranged ability, but not only that, it does a good amount of damage, and if you spec into it all the way to overflowing power, it also has pretty good AoE. Keep in mind though, if you want even more damage, you could also spec into Concentrated Release in the first row, as this increases the damage even further, but the charge time will also be way longer. So depending what you prioritize, speed over damage, this is also something you should keep note of. Next up is Cruel Cutter. This one also has one more option in the first row, which is Nimble Movement, although the bleed effect is nice, especially in boss fights. This attack is another ranged option that you have, but overall this is very nice for AoE and single target again, so it's something you should always keep in mind. And now for everyone's favorite PvP ability, which is, well, in the Russian version is called Enhance. Now it's going to be called Thrust Impact. This ability is very high damage, especially once you get it to 10 points with Spectral Explosion. Basically means that you can't generate identity meter anymore, but in return it does way more damage. I would go with Swift Thrust, Deep Thrust, and Spectral Explosion. If you want the ability to be even faster than it already is, you could get into Enhanced Explosion in the second row as well. Keep in mind this ability is mainly used for single target DPS, so Wide Explosion is maybe an option if you need a little bit more AoE, but overall this is just picked up if you need more single target boss damage. Now that the most important abilities are out of the way, let's talk about Howl for a second. You get this ability at level 40, and especially if you play in a group, I would recommend getting this one. Why? Because on 10 points, this actually increases the damage of everyone in your group for 6 seconds by 12%. This is a big burst damage increase, and if you are playing in a group, this is definitely worth picking up. But as I said, more of a utility tool, not the highest priority at all, and it's more like a filler if you feel like you need more burst window damage. Another filler if you feel like you have a couple points left over and you don't really know where to put them, Demolition. For me though, this is I mostly use this as a filler if I feel like I need a little bit more single target DPS. But if you can put some further points into the ability, Charge Slash in the very last row gives you a good amount of mobility as well, and you could even spec into Excellent Mobility in the first row on top of that. But as I said, this ability is already good without a lot of investment, just keep that in mind. And lastly, another filler ability if you want even more mobility is Sharpened Cut. This is mainly used in PvP actually, but during the leveling process, if you feel like you have points left over again and you need more mobility, this is a very easy 7-point dash that allows you to engage further and also get out of tricky situations quickly. Okay, now for the summary. First, DPS. We talked about Demonic Clone already. You get it level 10, and I feel like throughout the entire leveling process, it's a great ability to have as it is useful against mob groups and boss fights as well. Okay, next on level 14 is Demonic Vision, your first ranged ability, and as I said before, this is about priority. So once you maxed out Demonic Clone, Demonic Vision is a great second max, and it does a lot of damage if you can get it to level 10 early on. Next up is Cruel Cutter, another ranged ability, and we talked about this a little bit already, but I just wanted to mention that this is already available at level 12, so you could put this on your hotbar early on without investing into it. Once your Demonic Clone and your Demonic Vision are maxed out, you can start putting points into this one. And the last one on the DPS priority, as I said before, was also Thrust Impact. Thrust Impact, very good for single target DPS, very good for boss fights. Some people even spec out of the AoE abilities to spec into Thrust Impact while they're doing boss fights. So that's always something to keep in mind, as you also get it very early on. And below you can see utility again. Demonic Slash at level 10, your best mobility tool, and it will stay that way until level 50, or even beyond level 50, honestly. There's a lot of mobility here, a good dash, even 2 dashes if you spec into it, and the mobility, the movement speed buff afterwards is also very useful. And lastly, you can see Howl again that you get level 40, especially useful if you're in a group. If you're not in a group, you can probably spec into some other more baseline abilities, but if you are in a group, the 12% damage increase in burst windows can make bosses die very quickly. And that is everything for today. As I said, Demonic has a lot of different options, especially if you consider the identity meter and how it like interacts with your build and your tripods. But overall, I think the transformation is just a nice bonus whenever you get it. So I think putting too many points into it early on is not the best way to approach leveling. Although, as I said, always, leveling is more of a tutorial anyway. So if you wanna tinker around with some other builds, feel free to do so as always. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing, always helps out. If you have more advanced questions, you can probably catch me live on Twitch. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a good one, and see you on launch. Peace.